All right, so today, yeah, like I just mentioned, we're going to be covering the Trompowsky attack, and by good fortune, I guess, happened to see a Trompowsky attack today with Shanklin playing it against Jeffrey Jean. So we'll later see how that game ends up, I guess. So the Trompowsky attack, if you didn't know, was named after a Brazilian chess player who, played chess for the most part in the middle of the 20th century, and he first tried it out in the early 30s and had a lot of success and kept playing it in his career, and that's why it bears his name now. He contributed a lot to his development, and I gave a couple of his early games, one of his first games with it actually, in the list that Lucas will send you. So the Trompowsky attack starts out in d4, knight f6, and bishop g5. So one of the first pluses of this opening is that you avoid a lot of theory. You avoid the King's Indian defense, you avoid the Gruenfeld, you avoid the Nimzo Indian, and the Queen's Indian. So you avoid a lot of theory, which is nice. Of course, the main move you'll see here is c4, right? That's the big main line. But yeah, bishop g5, the whole point of it is to avoid all those lines, right? And for me, as white, I'll play it if I just don't want to run into theory. If I'm playing someone who I know is an expert in the Gruenfeld and I just have neglected to study that recently, I might play something like Trompowsky against them. Just to avoid the theory that they know and get into a kind of chess game that's easier to play without knowing theory, right? I mean, one downside of Trompowsky is that it more or less does turn into a chess game. What I mean by that is the game, for the most part, is not going to be decided by some opening theory, for the most part, because there are some lines that you need to know. You don't want to play the Trompowsky if you're playing someone who's much higher rated than you, in my opinion anyway, because it's probably not going to turn out well. Basically, my opinion is that if you're playing someone much stronger than you, want to play something sharp. You don't want to play something slow like this that will let the rating difference tell, basically. So that's my recommendation. But if you're playing someone weaker than you, this will be an awesome choice. Okay. All right, so now let's get into the meat of it. So there's a few big main lines. d5 is perhaps the most annoying one, which we'll get to. Knight e4 is possible too, just avoiding doubling of pawns and attacking the bishop at tempo. That's very logical. And c5, which is theoretically at least maybe the most complicated or critical. The other lines with d5 and knight e4 I think are a bit easier to understand. Yeah.
What about h6?
So h6 kind of plays into white's hands, so white would gladly just take on f6. Yeah, h6 is a wasted tempo, basically. That's what white wants to do. If you take with the g pawn, although you have the open g file, your pawn structure is wrecked, and h6 is not a useful move, because sometimes the bishop will come out to h6, actually. So taking away that square is annoying. g6 is possible if black is obsessed with trying to get a King's Indian, but that doesn't work out so well. And one of the games I gave you was between Michael Adams and Garry Kasparov, where Kasparov tried to play g6, make it into a King's Indian, but it doesn't work out well, and you'll see why, and I'll talk about that. What's that, Elliot?
Because if he takes, then the bishop is...
You mean after h6 or after g6?
After g6.
Oh, whoops. d4, knight f6. Yeah, the problem black has here is basically due to his pawn structure. It's not that black's pawn structure is bad, but that it's static, and you'll see the problem with that. And I'll show you a nice setup for white, which gives you easy play. Okay. But first, I actually want to look at c5, because essentially, I think white has to play a pawn gambit if you want any chance for advantage. So c5 is kind of attempted at Benoni, except that white's played an early bishop g5, which is good and bad. It's good because it's development and gets bishop out to a good square. But the downside is it leaves b2 undefended. And after d5, queen b6, this is exactly what black is trying to take advantage of. Now, one idea for white here is to take on f6 and ruin black's pawn structure that way, right? If you wanted to do that, you would play this move order and then play d5. You just want to avoid letting black have the option to take with the queen. And although this line is fine for white, say queen b6, queen c1, and I also showed you a miniature where Shirov loses to Peter Wells in like 13 moves, I think it was. although this line is okay, I really don't think white's chance for advantage is that great. Simply because white's queen is kind of passively placed, and you're giving up the two bishops. I don't think the pawn on d5 is really that special enough to compensate for all that.
Why don't you just put the b2, b3?
So as a general rule, you don't want to put all your pawns on one color square if you can help it. Yeah, in this case, b3 just weakens dark squares on the queen side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, after a move like f5, black would be clearly better, basically. Because his bishop comes to g7, and these dark squares on the queen side are just hard to defend. So the point of playing queen c1 is that after like f5, you can play c3 and blunt this bishop when it comes to g7. Okay. So anyway, I prefer d5. After queen d6, white's essentially committed to a real gambit, so knight c3. So now queen takes b2. If black doesn't take the pawn, it's hard to justify why you play queen b6, right? So queen takes. And now you play this somewhat surprising move, bishop d2. Just defending the knight. And white makes the first fight of the game, so if black just tries developing with a move like g6, then rook b1 and knight b5 wins a lot of material, right? Since black cannot get back to defend the c7 square. So with bishop d2, white makes the first threat here. So black should retreat immediately before that queen gets stuck and rook b1, knight b5 ideas become a problem. So now e4. So white begins advancing, pretty much threatening e5 right away when white's space advantage would be so huge, the compensation would be beyond any kind of doubt. And now black is essentially forced to play e5. A move like d6 is possible if you follow up with e5, but generally speaking it's too passive. White would play f4, followed by knight f3, and e5. So black has to try to clog the center himself. Now, we don't want to take on e6 because that would get rid of our big pawn center. So, just like another line, we continue with f4. And now d6, since black doesn't want to cede the center. Now you can continue with rook b1, getting a tempo on the queen. Queen d8. The queen almost never goes to c7 since you can just harass it. So queen d8. Now knight f3. Developing this piece and attacking e5. And now knight d7. And now white plays a move that may look surprising, but f5. The point of this is to gain a permanent space advantage on the king side and sets up some nasty ideas. So white can either follow up with expanding on the king side with g4, g5, or a different idea too. So let's say bishop e7. Now knight g5. This move may look ridiculous, but white's idea is after h6, you can actually play knight e6 here. And after f takes, and white's point is that he's essentially up a piece because this bishop on c8 is going to find a hard time to ever enter the game. So this is kind of a nifty sacrifice. After, say, knight f8, bishop c4, black is going to be suffering. Although black has the extra piece, it's going to be hard to justify what that piece is going to be doing for you. So it's a very dangerous possible idea there. But knight g5 isn't the only idea here. You can also play for g4. So you can play rook g1 and follow up with g4. Of course, the idea is to play g4, g5, h4, just gain space on the king side. And black's extra pawn on the queen side isn't that useful. This passive bishop on c8, passive bishop on e7, not really that great. So the key moves to keep in mind here are after queen b6, you play knight c3, gambiting the pawn, and then bishop back. Remember, you have this threat of rook b1 and knight b5, so black has to return, and then you just push in the center. And the other key move to remember is to play f5 in these lines. Playing f5 also stops black from taking on f4 and getting the e5 square for the knight. So playing f5 is important. What you're trying to do with this move is get space on the king side and restrict that bishop on c8. Keep it passive. Okay. So any questions on how to handle this line for white so far? All right.
What if black takes on f4 before pulling out his other knight?
If black takes on f4, I think e5 immediately is pretty strong. After a move like knight g8, you can probably play d6, and you're already threatening knight d5, c7. But these two bad bishops look like disaster to me. Because black pretty much has to try to control the e5 square. Okay. So, that line is the only line where I think really white has to gambit a pawn. So it's good to know the ideas there. Okay. So another important line that you'll probably face a lot too is knight e4. It's natural because you avoid doubling of pawns and you attack the white bishop. So where does your bishop go? Right? My preference is to go to f4. The reason I prefer here is that if you go to h4, black can play g5 and get the two bishops. It's not the end of the world, okay, especially since you're playing the Trompowsky. You kind of imply that you're willing to give him up, but I just don't like letting black get that. So I prefer bishop f4. And of course, now if g5, you can go back to c1. And black has weakened this king side now. So after bishop f4, black can again try for c5. And now d5 and then queen b6. Now this time you can't play the same knight c3 idea since b2 and black can just take your knight. So we have to play bishop c1. But although it looks kind of weird moving your bishop so many times, problem is the queen on b6 isn't that well placed and neither is the knight. And you can get tempes on the knight with f3 and e4. So now say g6, you can play f3. Then when the knight retreats, you can follow up with e4. Now, this position essentially resembles, a Benoni, what black has played, and as white, you're basically playing the same-ish setup. But there is one nice thing for white, and it's the fact that white's delayed developing the knight on b1. That's actually kind of nice because after, say, d6, c4, bishop g7, white can actually play knight e2, and then this knight to c3. And white can either delay the development of the knight, so it can go to a3, or it can go to d2 later. In any event, the main advantage is that it's going to be hard for black to play the normal lines where you play e6 and take on d5. So for example, e6, white can play knight a3, and the problem black has is that if he takes on d5, then knight c4 followed by a4 and bishop f4, and white's going to have a good Benoni because d6 is under pressure so early. Normally, what happens in these positions is if white's not familiar with what to do, you might play knight c3, castle, say bishop d3 or knight e2. White doesn't have that same idea anymore, right? So say you play a move like queen c2, takes, and this is just fine for black now, essentially, because white doesn't have the same pressure with the knight on c3 and e2 like that. So remember, that's the advantage of playing a Trompowsky move order, is that you can move your king's knight to c3, and your queen's knight can go to a3 or d2, and then later c4. So does that idea make sense? So not having committed your b1 knight's pretty handy. Okay. Now another thing to look at is if black just lets you take the knight. So an important line to know what to do is if black plays g6. Because a lot of people play knight f6 with the intention of playing the king's Indian defense, right? So against this, we take the knight to mess up that pawn structure. And now e3, supporting that pawn on d4. Now say bishop g7, c4. And we arrange our pieces like so. Castles, knight c3, say d6. And now we play g3. But you want to flank out this bishop because it's going to be very useful in this long diagonal. Say knight d7, bishop g2, f5, knight e2. Your knight goes to e2 to not block your bishop, and because later it might go to f4 or join you on the queen side. So knight f6, castle. And what I like about this position is it's really easy to play for white since you just follow up with b4, a4, and attack on the queen side. Together with this bishop on g2, it's really nice. And if black tries to blunt your bishop's scope on the queen side with c6 and d5, you're going to have instant pressure on that since you have so many pieces that can attack that square. So it's hard for black to blunt that bishop. And if he doesn't, well, you're going to have fun on the queen side. And you'll see the game with Adams and Kasparov, where Kasparov, basically struggled to ever neutralize that last grid bishop. And there's also a Larry Christensen game, I think, from the U.S. Championship, where he does the same thing there. So remember the setup of pieces. For the most part, if black plays g6 and lets you double those pawns, this is the kind of piece setup you're going to aim for. Okay. So any questions on that? All right, cool. And now another important line is d5. There's a couple ways you can play against this. One way is you can just take on f6 and double the pawns, and that's essentially what happened, although a slightly different move order in the Shanklin-Zhang game today. And there's also been some high-level games where white takes an f6, like last year in the London Classic. I think Caruana, don't remember who he was playing, but he also played the same bishop takes knight idea. But my preference actually is to play knight d2 here, just because I prefer keeping the bishops if I can. But although I prefer keeping the two bishops, bishop takes f6 is perfectly fine here. It's just a matter of taste. So knight d2, and that idea of this is to stop knight e4, right? And with knight d2, your main idea as white is to play kind of a reverse Slav if black is ambitious enough. So you might follow up with e3, bishop d3, knight f3, and you're kind of playing a nice reverse Slav since your bishop's out on g5 actively placed. But it won't necessarily always happen. For example, if bishop f5, black already has to be a little bit careful. So you can play c4, c6, and now queen b3. So it's kind of like a bizarre Slav where you played knight d2. But the nice thing is after a move like queen b6, you can play c5. And you actually have this nice pressure on the queen side. So say your main idea here is b4, b5, and black really doesn't want to allow it. So say you play a6, you can just play b4. After knight d7, play e3. And you're already threatening b5, so say black tries to move the rook off that diagonal. Now you can play knight b3, followed by knight a5, and black has some difficulties in guarding that d7 pawn. So there's just one kind of innocent line where black can get into trouble really quickly if he's not careful. So the most testing line is essentially c5, so black tries to play a queen's gambit. And here you can play e3, knight c6, c3. So you're playing kind of like a Slav style. Now e5 is always possible in these positions, but it's not too dangerous. You can just play knight f3, and you gain some tempi for development. And if you play the Caro-Kann as black, you'll notice his pawn structure looks pretty familiar, right? So say queen b6, play queen b3, e6, knight f3, say bishop b7, bishop b2. You can also play bishop d3 here. That's fine as well. And again, you're basically playing reverse Slav as white. Kind of the same ideas apply there. At some point, you might aim for taking on c5 and e4, or playing c4. All right. So there's one more idea that I haven't looked at, and that's bishop g5, knight e4, and then g6. So again, black is aiming to play a King's Indian, right? Or, in this case, a perk. So one way of playing as white is f3 and then e4. And you're essentially playing a kind of perk setup. Or if you don't mind playing a King's Indian as white, you're essentially playing a same-ish after d6, c4, where you have this extra move, bishop f4, which actually isn't that useful, but it is an extra move. Another way of playing as white is queen d3. After knight f6, then you can play e4. And now you have a really offbeat kind of perk opening. After d6, white has this kind of extra move, queen d3, which is nice, although the queen can be a little bit misplaced. Might follow up with knight c3, castle queenside. So that's one way of doing it. So you really have options as white if black plays knight e4 and g6. If you prefer playing e4 style, you can play f3, e4, queen d3, knight c3 stuff, or you can go for c4 and return the normal queen's pawn style of play. Okay. So, any questions on what I've just talked about?
When, if ever, should you play d takes c5?
Usually as white you don't want to. Although you can, just like in the Slav, if you can win a pawn. So you're talking about if black plays d5 and c5?
Or just c5 now. Right?
Okay, yeah, if c5. Yeah, taking usually isn't a good idea because black can round up that pawn with a nice position, like say knight a6 here, and it's hard to defend that pawn in c5 basically. If you play a move like bishop e3, you can get harassed. Taking on c5 can be okay. Usually it's if it's hard for black to wrap up the pawn. So after d5, c3, c5, taking on c5 is definitely viable here because wrapping up the c5 pawn isn't a trivial task for black basically. So yeah, I would basically recommend only taking on c5 if you've played c3 and black hasn't protected c5, just like in the Slav, really. If black plays c5 and you're ready to support it with b4, you can definitely consider taking it. It's a good rule of thumb there.
And one other question I had is, you said that this is an opening to play against particularly lower-rated opponents. Are there any early dangers, traps, quick attacks that white can mount if black's not vigilant?
So one example is from that Shirov miniature that I showed, although it's not on the line I recommend. But that game went takes, queen b6, queen c1, and bishop h6, e3, f5. Bishop h6 is a cute move because if you take, then you lose a rook on a1. Now e3, f5, and I'll see if I can recall what happened there. Let's see. I actually don't remember how that game went. But it is a nice trap. Basically, black was trying to utilize that the queen was guarded. It was tied to b2, but it didn't work out. Let me see. Yeah, this was the game. Alright, so you can see what Wells did to Shirov here. Okay, he played f5 first. So Shirov thought that he could just take on f4, but he didn't realize that because of black's lack of development, it's basically just losing. Now, white's threatening to trap the queen here with queen c1, so black has to get out with the queen while he can. But after d6, it's hard to say how he can defend against checkmate. And already, black just resigned.
Because the e6, knight d5 stuff.
Yeah, I think if e6, bishop d3, and then queen g5. Yeah, that's probably the fastest I've seen Shirov lose.
Kidding.
So, this is an example of a trap. Although for the most part, it's not really a trappy opening. Although that that pawn sacrifice line, this is definitely full of danger for black.
Yeah.
Black really has to know his stuff to not, lose pretty quickly here. And if you follow my recommendation, it's pretty easy to play for white. I've had many nice wins in blitz and wrapping games playing this way as white. This line of queen b6 takes b2 became very popular after Polgar wrote a brief article on the Trompowsky in Chess Life when I was younger, and after that, she recommended that black play c5 and queen b6. So I noticed that it really became popular after that, at least for players under 2,000. So yeah, this will definitely be a line I expect you guys will face a lot. All right. Any other questions? The main way to learn how to play this opening is to go over a lot of the games that I sent you, and a lot of the times this opening will turn into a reverse Slav, so understanding that opening and those pawn structures will really help you with this opening too. All right?